Are you struggling with S-turns? Today on Free Pilot Training, I'm going to show you in detail how to make the perfect S-turn. Welcome to another episode of Free Pilot Training. I'm Josh and this is my father-in-law Mike, and today I'm going to show you how to perform S-turns. This is an excellent ground reference maneuver that will help you hone your skills as a pilot, and if you're working on your private pilot's license, you may be required to perform this maneuver on the check ride.
The FAA wants you to learn ground reference maneuvers like the S-turn because these can really help you develop a feel for controlling the airplane in the wind. And that's important because when you fly an airplane, there's almost always going to be wind. And not only can the wind affect your airplane's direction of travel, it can also determine how fast you're moving over the ground. And this is what we call our ground speed. Once again, flying an airplane is a lot like steering a boat. If I want to drive my boat over here and the current is moving this direction, I kind of have to drive my boat at an angle if I want it to travel in this direction. We have the same thing in an airplane. We must account for the wind speed and direction if we want the airplane to do what it's told.
Come on. Do it! Do it!
If I want to travel in a straight line this direction, and I have a wind coming from over here, then I have to crab into the wind to fly this line. With that in mind, we also have to account for the wind speed because when I make my turn, my ground speed is what determines the ground track that my airplane flies. When there's a headwind and my ground speed is very slow, I can turn in a shorter distance than if I have a tailwind and my ground speed is faster. Because of that, when we perform S-turns and we want to make a ground track that resembles an S, we have to control our airplane differently at different points along our maneuver if we want that S shape to be even. And that's basically what we're trying to accomplish. We want to make an S shape over a line that we pick out on the ground. So let's talk about getting set up for this maneuver.
Remember, before we do anything else, we need to make sure that we clear the area. Before we perform any maneuvers, I'm just going to go ahead and knock out some clearing turns, and then I'll be watching for traffic constantly for the rest of the maneuver. Alright, clear left. Look clear, I'm not seeing anybody out here. Let's make a couple turns that are more than 90 degrees, and then come back, and we'll do a couple maneuvers here. Did pretty good that direction. Clear right. Going back to the right, you seen anybody on ADSB there?
Not anywhere close.
Okay. Clear right, coming right.
Before we get started, remember what I just said. If we want this S-turn to look good, we need to account for wind. It's not going to be pretty if you don't do that. Unless you get lucky and there's no wind on your check ride, which is actually what happened to me when I took my private pilot check ride.
Lucky?
Anyway, the next thing we need to do is determine the wind direction and airspeed. I personally like grabbing the weather from the nearest airfield, but there are a few other ways you can determine the wind speed and direction. Smoke is probably the best wind indicator there is. It's very easy to tell which direction the wind is blowing by looking at where the smoke is headed. If the smoke's just kind of floating up and off, then the wind speed's pretty low, and it's a perfect day to try this maneuver. You can also look at the ripples in the water and the grain in the fields, but this is usually a little bit more difficult. Or, if you want to get really crazy, you can even try out the old cow sock. Because apparently, cows typically face downwind if it's really windy, and they're eating. Bet you didn't know that, did you? Now we need to pick an altitude between 600 and 1,000 feet AGL. So if the elevation in this area is around 700 feet, 1,400 feet MSL is a good altitude to perform this maneuver. Remember, there are towers 1,000 feet and taller, so keep an eye out for those in addition to traffic. Alright, now that we picked an altitude, we need to stay at that altitude for the entire maneuver. In the Airman Certification Standards, it says that you must maintain your altitude within 100 feet, and your airspeed needs to stay within 10 knots of the airspeed you pick. But there's really nothing that tells you what airspeed you should fly for S-turns. The Airplane Flying Handbook explains how to perform the maneuver, then the ACS tells you that you have to maintain your airspeed within 10 knots. But apparently you can fly these at whatever airspeed you want. Remember, you do need to use good risk management though, so consider what your stall speed will be in a 45-degree bank turn. In addition to that, I also recommend keeping it below maneuvering speed or VA just to protect against an over-G.
Today I'll be flying my S-turns at 90 knots. This just gives me a stall buffer if I reach 45 degrees angle of bank, and it'll also keep me from an over-G. Then I'll just set my power so the plane will hold 90 knots. And as I begin the maneuver, I'll put in a bump of power somewhere around 100 RPM, and then I shouldn't have to worry about my power the rest of the time. After that, I'll pick a line-shaped reference point like a road or something that's perpendicular with the wind and enter the maneuver with the wind.
Now, the Airman Certification Standards do not specify that you need to enter with the wind. It only says that you need to apply adequate wind drift correction during straight and turning flight to maintain a constant ground track and radius of turn. But the Airplane Flying Handbook says that you should enter the maneuver downwind. And the reason they tell you to do that is because if you enter downwind every time, it's going to be a lot easier to figure out what you need to do. Now let's talk about how to perform an S-turn. First, I'm going to explain this maneuver the way the FAA does. And then I'm going to share a little secret that I think you're going to find super helpful. Because for some reason, we all throw our brains out the window when we start flying. And it's really difficult to fly without a brain.
Some people without brains do an awful lot of
Flying.
don't they?
Yes, I guess you're right.
Alright, before we get started, we need to pick a reference line. And like I mentioned a second ago, we need to pick some kind of big line that's going to be easy to see from the plane. This can be a road, a line of trees, a river, or just about anything that forms a straight line that can be seen from the air. But remember, we want this reference line to be perpendicular with the wind. I like making things as easy on myself as possible. Now, I need to decide how big I want to make my S-turns. A good size is to make the turns with a radius between 1/4 and 1/2 mile. If you're new, it's a little easier to make the turns a little bit bigger, but play around with a few sizes and use the easiest one for you. Keep in mind, you can start S-turns with a right turn or a left turn. I recommend practicing both ways, but for some reason, I usually like turning right first. It's just a little bit more natural, I guess. Just remember to stay coordinated. The rudder should be tied to the ailerons to account for adverse yaw. Remember, we're entering with the wind, so as we begin the maneuver, we need to keep that in mind. As we pass our reference line, we'll be getting pushed by the wind. This means that we need our bank to be very steep so we don't get pushed too much. But in addition to that, this is where our ground speed is going to be the fastest because we're moving with the wind. This is important because the size of our turn radius is directly related to our ground speed. The faster our ground speed is, the bigger our turn radius of the ground will be. This means that when we start our first turn, this will be our steepest bank. But as we start to get perpendicular to the wind, we need to reduce our bank a little because our ground speed is dropping. But we're still getting pushed, so we don't want to reduce the bank too much. As we start to roll out into the wind, we want our wings to be completely level by the time we cross our reference line. And we're flying head on into the wind, which means our ground speed is at its lowest. The temptation now is to start the next turn as you cross your line. And you don't want to do that unless the wind is completely calm. When you start that next turn depends completely on the wind, and that's why we practice this maneuver. If the wind is blowing really hard, you might find yourself counting off a couple potatoes before you start making the turn. And when you start turning, it needs to be really shallow because you're fighting against the wind. As you parallel your reference line, start steepening up that bank to end up wings level across your reference line. And that's where we end the maneuver. You can just continue straight ahead to continue your training. But if you want to keep practicing, you can continue making as many S's as you want as long as there's nothing in your way and you have time to do so. Keep in mind, this is the way the FAA wants me to explain it to you guys, but I've noticed that it usually confuses people when I explain it this way. Here are a couple other ways I like to explain it that seems to make a little bit more sense to everyone. If you've had a few flight lessons, you may already have a pretty good feel for the controls on your airplane. Because of that, one simple method you can use is to pick out a couple points that you can fly over that will make the S the same side on one side as it is on the other. For example, if I chose this road as a reference line, I might fly over this tree over here on this side. Then I'll work the turn so I end up wings level across my road. Then I'll make the second part of my turn so that I fly right over the top of this little pond right here. Once again, we only need to make one S to complete the maneuver. But if you want to keep practicing, it's okay to keep S-ing down the reference line. But remember, we need to maintain the altitude that we chose at the beginning of the S-turn. And we chose 1,400 feet MSL because that's between 600 and 1,000 feet AGL. Now, when I'm flying this maneuver, I'm mainly looking at my reference line. Then I'm taking quick glances inside at my altimeter, then back outside. And because we're flying on the front side of the drag curve, we need to use elevator and aileron to maintain our altitude. Then I might periodically peak at my airspeed, But if I set my power correctly, I shouldn't have to mess with that too much. And don't forget to look straight ahead as well to make sure that you're not going to run into something in front of you. Make the S as even as possible by using those flyover points. Then exit straight ahead in the same direction that you started the maneuver. Okay, but maybe I don't have any flyover points around my reference line that I can use to help me make an even S shape. Now what? This is the way I like to teach S turns. Stretch the S. If you want to ace this maneuver, all you have to do is stretch the S into the wind. Remember, the wind is pushing us. So if we want to draw the perfect S and we want our wings to be level across this line, we can't just fly this shape over the ground. Start the maneuver by turning early. We're getting pushed by the wind and that makes our ground speed faster. But because the wind is pushing us, if we turn early, we end up being right where we need to be. As we continue the turn, we're slowly taking out a little bank because our ground speed is decreasing, but we're still getting pushed by the wind over here. Depending on the wind over here, we may not need any bank as we're headed back towards our reference point. And this is where we want to start stretching our S. We need to be patient and drive ahead past the reference line. We have to stretch that S into the wind because our ground speed is slower and we're getting pushed back. As we begin to make our next turn, we need to be a little bit more aggressive on the bank so we can roll out wings level again as we pass our reference line to end the maneuver. And this method works great because if the wind is stronger, you simply stretch your S further into the wind, and that will account for wind speed. Just keep in mind when you're traveling with the wind, your turn radius is going to be bigger. And that means if you want this part of the S to be the same size as this one, you also need to use more bank with the wind and less bank into the wind. Alright, now that you know that, let's go back out to the plane and try this S turn for real.
Alright, my controls. Alright, so what we want to do here is we want to, one, enter with the wind. Winds are out of the north today, so we're going to be on a southbound heading. I'm flying 90 knots today. That's a good airspeed for this plane. And then 600 to 1,000 AGL is roughly 1,400 feet in this area. So we'll fly this maneuver at 1,400 feet. So 90 knots, 1,400, southbound heading is what we're going to start out on. And I guess we'll start out with the left turn. Got a road over here. That's going to be my reference line. We'll get set up on a southbound heading, cross this at 1,400 feet, and we'll start out with a left turn here. Alright, looks like about 23, 2,400, somewhere in there is going to give me 90 knots. I'm a little low here. The wind's kind of beating me up out here today. Alright, so we're still getting set up here. We'll use this road directly in front of us here. That way we start on all our parameters. You always want to start on your parameters, that way it's a lot easier to maintain those. Well, if you're not like in between those two altitudes or something, you don't have to maintain something weird. Okay, so I got my power set somewhere about 23, 2,400 RPM. We'll start with the left-hand turn here. Golly, the wind is just popping that airspeed up. Alright, so somewhere right in here, we'll start our turn, and we're getting pushed by the ground. We're getting pushed by the wind, so our ground speed's higher, and we're also getting pushed. So this is going to be our steepest bank angle right here. Okay, so we're keeping it somewhat steep here, but somewhere parallel to the road, we roll out just a tiny bit. But then we're still getting pushed, so we want to keep that turn coming. Getting a little slow, getting a little low. Put in a little power there to keep us too low. And then we'll roll out over across our road, wings level, so somewhere right in there. And then this is a little bit less steep bank right here because we're driving it into the wind. So we want to start a turn, but we don't want to turn too hard. And now you can feel like we're getting pushed over right now, so this is where we kind of need to start steepening that bank back up. So somewhere right in here, we need to steepen that bank back up, put in a bump of power so we don't get too slow. Keep that turn coming. So we roll out wings level across our road there. And somewhere right in there, we'll roll out wings level, and hopefully we made an S about the same shape, or about the same size. Yeah, that's pretty close right there.
Not bad, yeah.
Alright, and that's how you perform that maneuver. I hope you guys learned something from this video today. It really means a lot that you guys keep coming back to me for more training. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to smash that like button for me before you go check out another one of my videos that will make you a better pilot. See ya!